Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, last Thursday and Friday, the Biden administration held its first ever summit for democracy, which, if we're honest, ended up being, unfortunately, a giant lesson in hypocrisy. Now, before we go into the many layers of hypocrisy that became glaringly obvious during this summit, to be fair to the White House, Biden acknowledged the U.S. has its own fair share of problems and needs work. This comes as a 2021 report from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance listed the U.S. as a backsliding democracy for some of our pandemic responses that limited freedoms and the questioning of elections. The White House promoted the event as an opportunity for like-minded countries to strengthen democracy during a time when the world is seeing democracy slip backwards. But when you take a look at who was invited and who wasn't, it looks more like America playing politics rather than looking to protect and promote democracy, especially knowing the summit was virtual, allowing for an unlimited number of seats. But to no surprise, Russia and China were not invited to the summit, but the Philippines under Duterte and Brazil under Bolsonaro were. In some cases, it was obvious why the nation wasn't invited because they simply aren't democracies, as in the case of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. But in other cases, nations with very low freedom scores were invited over other nations with much higher scores. For example, Pakistan and the Democratic Republic of Congo were invited, while Singapore and Tunisia were left out. Was this really about democracy, or was this about rewarding countries who favor the U.S. while snubbing those who cozy up to Russia and China? The summit, though poorly attended, wasn't without drama. Taiwan was invited, no doubt, to aggravate China, but the U.S.'s relationship with China is one that is delicate. On one hand, the U.S. wants to slow down and limit China's growing influence. On the other, the administration understands the U.S. needs China and can't cross certain boundaries. Leading up to the summit, the U.S. announced it was diplomatically boycotting the Beijing Olympics, and the White House invited Taiwan to participate in the summit. Now, both of these acts were meant to flex towards China, but when a Taiwanese minister was presenting during the summit, they committed a cardinal sin of recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation by showing the island in a different color as mainland China on a map. At that moment, the White House actually cut the feed. That's right. During a summit about strengthening democracy, the White House actually censored a Taiwanese minister as they asserted their independence and freedom from China. During the summit, nations committed themselves to a free press and strengthening independent journalism. On Thursday, Biden remarked, quote, "A free and independent media is the bedrock of democracy. It's how the public stays informed and how governments are held accountable." Yet, the very next day, the U.S. won its appeal in a British court, bringing Julian Assange one step closer to extradition. The U.S. intends to prosecute a publisher who exposed government war crimes while lecturing the world on press freedom. On top of this, the U.S. government has been pressuring big tech to censor independent voices and even shut down independent news channels in the name of combating misinformation. The most hypocritical aspect to the summit is the U.S.'s history of promoting democracy. The U.S. hasn't been exactly diplomatic in its past quest to bring people of the world toward freedom through invasions, color revolutions, coups, and sanctions. The U.S.'s attempts at exporting and promoting democracy has been anything but democratic. The U.S. has a history of believing democracy needs to be brought about, ironically, by force. And it isn't even in the history of the U.S., it's in our present as well. Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and others are currently living under the threat of U.S. intervention and debilitating sanctions. So when the U.S. holds a summit gathering allied nations together and discusses doing what's necessary to prevent the rise of authoritarianism in the world, one must ask, what do they mean by this? And I think that's the big question. You know, when you get together with these foreign countries and you say, okay, we're going to talk trade. Okay, that makes sense. You get together, you say, we're going to talk climate because we all have to work together on this. Okay, that makes sense. But when you get together and you say, we're going to talk democracy and ensuring democracy around the world and even exporting and promoting democracy around the world, how do you think they intend to really go about that? Peacefully, diplomatically, forcefully?
Well, and a great many liberals seem to talk about democracy as if the definition of democracy is just good things that we, the good liberals, want and support and like. And it's, how could you be against that? And you know, you're crazy for opposing it. The conversation around the concept of democracy has become so fraught in the last several years. Where and look, I think some of the Republican efforts to make voting harder. In some cases, yes, I could see how that counts as like an anti-democracy measure. But now, like, every article about everything the right does is they're destroying democracy. They're savaging democracy. It's like, but actually, democracy is the process by working out like whose policies will triumph. So it's not always anti-democratic when the other side is like trying to enforce their will. Like, that is the democratic process. So this conversation seems very frustrating to me.
And we've had so many wars, we've exported and had so many wars saying we got to stop communism. Communism was the big bad thing, and we went into all these wars over it. Now, if it's like, authoritarianism and the rise of authoritarianism in the world, is that going to march us into more aggressive action?
A lot of democracy needed defending, no doubt about it. I was glad that you mentioned Julian Assange, because at the same time that they're pulling together these, this summit of democracy, they are giving huge amounts of fodder to authoritarian regimes around the world who can, now crack down on dissidents, crack down on whistleblowers, and crack down on their free press and say, look, this publisher here published some documents that you didn't like, and so you're trying to drive him into the grave. He, as we talked about earlier on the show, he had a mini stroke recently. Yeah. He has, his health has completely collapsed. His fiance says he's just a shell of the person that he used to be. This is what we're doing to a journalist, and so it gives the opportunity to dictators across the world to just laugh at the idea that we are in any way upholding values of democracy if they run even 1 degree away from the interest, what we perceive as our national interest.
It erodes our moral authority to confront China, to confront Russia, to confront other bad actors who are further down the path of authoritarianism than we are. But it makes it look hypocritical when we speak up about it.
When you actually look at the list that's put together, there's various different outlets that put together the freedom scores or democracy scores. And the list, the United States ranks, I think our score is 83 out of 100. There are 30, 40, maybe even 50 countries that rank above us, the most free countries in the world being Norway, Finland, Norway and Sweden, and I believe maybe Finland might be the other one that ranks in that 100 score. So, it would make sense if this summit for democracy was us kind of sitting back and saying, okay, what could we do better to strengthen our own democracy at home? What have we done wrong? What can we do moving forward to correct this? But instead it was, no, there are all these baddies in the world, and we've got to do something to stop the baddies.
Yeah, but
and
not
that's,
us. Not us.
Right,
all those other baddies.
And if we took that 83 and detracted 1 point for every democracy we had overthrown, we'd probably be in negative territory on that rank.
Probably would be.
But Kim, thank you for that, and we will have more Rising right after this.